All right, thank you all for coming out on a Friday, wonderful Friday afternoon before a big game. I am Dr. Christine Laveau-Haley, political science professor here in the Honors College, and I also coordinate the speakers for the GCF, the Grand Challenges Forum. So we're glad to have you here. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what you can expect for the rest of the semester before I call up our Dean, Heidi Apple, to introduce our speaker. So first up, our speaker, who's right in front of you. Michael Dimock is our first speaker, and we're very excited. Hopefully you had a chance to hear him last night at Convocation. We have Jacob Howland, Dean of the Intellectual Foundations Program, University of Austin, will speak to us on September 20th. October 4th, we have Julian Castro, Chief Executive Officer of the Latino Community Foundation. And November 1st, we have Amanda Stronza, and she is an environmental anthropologist from Texas A&M University. So please come and hear those speakers. We have very, very interesting speakers this semester, starting with today's. And I'm going to call up our Dean, Heidi Apple, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laveau-Haley. Welcome this afternoon. It's great to see the room full. In 1986, a young merit scholar arrived on the UH campus. Honors was a program then with only a couple hundred students at most, located in the basement of this library. One of the continuing strengths of honors education here at the University of Houston is our commitment to the Human Situation course, to study great thinkers of the past, to build a better future for us all. Michael attended the Human Situation course in the then newly built SEMO auditorium. I bet the shades worked well then. And it's still taught there. However, you had only one section of Human Sit, and the auditorium was not full. And we now have two, and those of you who have been through that know it's quite full each time. Michael graduated in 1990 with an honors in political science. As president of the Pew Research Center, Michael has used the skills he developed from his UH honors education to help us build a better future. Please welcome Michael Dimock.
There we go. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. Great, thank you so much. It's exciting to be back here talking at the Honors College, being back in the old stomping grounds, although I will say, you may have heard this from other old school alumni, there was something very clubby about our little basement hideaway back in the day. Nobody could find the door unless you knew where it was. It was kind of down at the end of this hidden sidewalk, and we could kind of hang out down there and feel like we had this hidden corner of the university to hang out in. This is a little more posh and exciting. I know you don't own this room, but I know you'll take it over. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what we do at the Pew Research Center to start. And then, since I'm talking with folks here at the university, and most of you are students, a little bit of how I got from point A to point Q, or wherever I am now in my journey, and how sort of paths and careers change and how my skills apply. And then, since this is the Grand Challenges Forum, I thought I'd share a little bit of some of the big challenges that I see emerging from what we study and what we're observing in the world that I think really are the challenges you all will have to help us solve, because they're going to be around for a while, and I think it's going to take new skill sets and new mindsets to try to address them. So at the Pew Research Center, we sort of start from the principle that if you believe in democracy, you believe that the will of the public should prevail, but that elections aren't necessarily the only tool for finding that, right? I tend to believe, and I was an old poli-sci professor, that elections are essential and flawed as a way of translating the public's will into decision making. They're flawed in the sense that they typically offer voters only a small range of choices, right? And especially in the US, typically only two. And one of the things you see in our polling and others is often people don't really like the choices they're being given, right? None of them quite feel right, right? And so choosing between A and B doesn't always feel satisfying. And then when the elected official the next day says, oh, that outcome means that the American people want X, you actually find most people saying, no, wait, that's not what I said, you know? So there's a challenge in there, right, of how do the elections truly sum up the public's will. They also happen only at limited points in time, right? So the moment that they're happening in captures something, but that doesn't always tell you how the public's feeling or what their priorities are as time goes on, which is relevant, I think. And I think importantly, not everybody's voice is represented in an election. I believe that the choice to vote is an important one. I'm assuming everyone here is registered and is voting this fall, right? Okay, don't make me ask too many times because it is really, really important. But it doesn't mean that people who chose not to vote or who weren't able to vote shouldn't still have a voice, right? Obviously, they made a choice or they weren't able to participate in a way that's tangible, but understanding their lived experience is still a part of understanding our nation, right? And understanding how policies will ultimately affect the well-being of that nation. And then I think the final challenge with elections is they're intrinsically as much about personalities and character as they are about policies and issues and priorities and values. And so, you know, the election is going to be a distillation of where the public is at that moment, given the choices that we were offered, given the personalities that were involved, and not necessarily representative of the whole of us. And so we think of polling as an essential complement, you know, to a strong democracy. It gives you the additional information and context. And at the Pew Research Center, we don't really invest much in, well, we don't invest anything in trying to predict what's going to happen in the election. There are a lot of other polls who do that. In Q&A, you can ask me how I think about that if you're interested in pre-election polling and what you can take from it. We actually care more about sort of the day after the election, right? And how we can say what happened, who did we hear from, who did we not hear from, how are people really seeing the outcome of this election, what are they hopeful for, what are they worried about, what do they think the election does and doesn't actually represent from their perspective. And that's sort of where we think public opinion can be an essential contribution. A second thing we think a lot about is there is no one American public opinion. And the thing that sort of gets under our craw is when you hear people say, the American people want this, you know, and you hear politicians say that all the time. There is no American people, singular, that wants this, singular, right? The whole notion of the country is its diversity. The whole notion of this country is it's a mix of people with different priorities and experiences and values, needs. And we should think about public opinion that way as a variable, as a multitude, I guess is what I mean to say. And two things we think a lot about is for a democracy, I think, to be really healthy, people need to be able to see themselves in it, right? Even if their side didn't win the election, even if an issue decision was, you know, policy was made that doesn't help them, they still need to see themselves as a part of that country. And so sometimes what I think surveys can do, and we have this experience a lot with people you know, who reach out to us, is to say, thanks for that poll. I thought I was all alone in this, but I can now see that there are a lot of other people who have shared the experience I have or who have the same concerns that I have, right? That, you know, even when you're in the minority, you can feel like you're not part of the overall community very easily. And I think one thing we put a lot of focus on in our survey work is to try to make sure that people can see themselves in that democracy, right? Not just in isolation from it or on the margins of it. And again, at the end of the day, this is a majoritarian country. This is a democracy, right? Not everybody is going to win every outcome in every election, but still being able to see how your voice is a part of that larger whole is something that we care a lot about, sort of a philosophical background to what we do. So the challenge for us is, and I'll kind of come to this, is, polling is really hard. It's hard to do well. It's easy to do badly. There's a marketplace of polling out there that most people don't have a terribly good impression of, right? Pollster is rarely one of the most trusted professions out in the world. But we still start from the preposition that there is a way to do it well. There is a way to think about how to make a real contribution with that tool. And that sort of defines sort of the challenge and the opportunity as we see it, as an institution. So let me switch over a little bit to how I got to doing that and how I got sort of passionate about that as a part of my life. As Dean Apple said, I came here in 1986. This was a younger, smaller program at the time. I think in 86, how old were we? About 15 years old at that time, Dean? Something like that, yeah. So I was in I guess by now, the earlier era of the program. I came from upstate New York, so it was a long trip for me, but my priority coming out of high school is I wanted to move to a big city that was far away from my small New England town, and Houston checked those boxes for sure. And what I didn't know, though, was just the kind of perfect mix of this program, having all the resources of an enormous, diversified university with all the assets that a place like U of H has, and then still having within it that opportunity for community building that can be hard to achieve in really big 30,000, 40,000 person universities. If you're, it's a challenge. That kind of social capital I was talking about, if you were at the event last night, can be a hard thing to build in a massive institution. And so that opportunity to have both of those in one place was something I didn't necessarily completely understand and appreciate at the time, but I certainly do many years later, and kind of try to impart how valuable that really is as something that you all have to build on. What led me into public opinion wasn't actually so much coursework. I did end up being a political science major, but I wandered around as what was then called undeclared, right? It's liberal studies now, but we just kind of wandered around for a long time before I settled into political science. And even when I did, I was doing more theory and more other kinds of political science courses. It was only even much later in my senior year that I started doing some courses on public opinion and voting. Actually, it was in the middle. I did an elections course in 1988, so that would have been sort of the middle of my college career. But by the time I left, I had also had the chance to actually do polling. A couple of the poli-sci professors were running the Dallas Morning News' poll, and they were running it out of PGH, and they hired about 10 or 12 students to make phone calls in the evenings, and we were calling people all over Texas and asking them questions about stuff that was going on. And so that was kind of a part-time job that I took off. But what I realized in it was actually really interesting. Like, you learn what's a good question and a bad question when you're literally asking it of somebody and you're like, you know what? The answer that person just gave me was not the answer to the question that my bosses were asking, if that makes any sense, right? Like, something got lost in translation there. They had an opinion that they just told me, but it was an answer to a different question. Like, there's a getting thoughts out of people's head is a really difficult puzzle, right? I often think that there are a lot of, science is about measurement at the end of the day. How can we really more accurately measure phenomenon in the world? I feel like what's in people's heads is one of the really hardest phenomena, one of the things to try to measure in the world. How do you get it out of their head with the least distortion as possible and with the most accuracy as possible? That's just like a puzzle that I started to get really interested in on the phone, talking to people all over. And then I got onto the back end of it, like the actual data processing and looking at the data and looking at the results and breaking them down by regions of Texas or different, younger people and older people. Like, oh, this is pretty cool. Wow, this is like really interesting other kind of puzzle. Like, how do you make sense of what people told you? How do you decide when something is really important to report out and share, like that kind of journalistic side of it, the reporting side of it, the analytical side of it? So by the end of that, and I was a senior, I didn't know really what I wanted to do. I didn't have a career path in mind, but I had built those relationships with those faculty. They kind of knew me. They knew what was kind of lighting my fuse, in the background. They had seen me operate in classes and outside of classes. And they gave me some good advice, which is, Michael, you could do this. You could do this Ph.D. thing, which I didn't necessarily have the confidence to do at the time. But also they kind of helped me figure out where that would be, And so I ended up doing a Ph.D. at University of California, San Diego, which was a great program in a lot of ways. It was also small. I was able to work directly with a lot of people. I was there for 5 years. But even there, career tracks aren't necessarily straightforward because even though the main purpose of training someone up for a Ph.D. in a field like political science is so that they can go out and become a political science professor, they really do a crappy job of teaching you how to teach, teaching you how to be a political science professor, right? So then you go out and you get this job and you think, aha, I've done it. And then you go in and you do your first class and you're like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. I have to create a curricula. I have to think about assignments. I have to think about how to explain this. Now I have to, it was a lot. It was a huge transition. You don't actually even know the job you're training for until you're in that job, right? And then that brings a whole new cycle of growth and exploration and sort of understanding what you want to do. And I love that job. The job I got out of graduate school, I was a professor at North Carolina State University. I didn't have to change my colors, and I apologize for forgetting. It was Red Friday. You guys need to remind me next time I visit, because I forgot. Yeah, go ahead.
You have a little bit of red on your shirt. I think that counts.
Thanks. Okay, I got a tiny bit, I guess. Yeah, so I don't know. I just hope the chancellor doesn't walk in. I know she'll be very disappointed in me. Yeah, so I really like the teaching. I love my colleagues. I love the community at NC State. It actually reminded me a lot of being here at U of H. But I was struggling with the research side of it. And what I was struggling with was the nature of doing academic research is a long process. You work on something for years, typically, often multiple years. A lot of it is very solo work, of you just struggling and reading and putting things together and analyzing and connecting thoughts and sending it off to get published and getting feedback on it and then having to rewrite it and send it off again and then getting more feedback on it. And, I'd been doing some projects out of my dissertation for 4 years at that point now, still working on them, still moving them through. And it was hard. It was not filling me with joy at that point. And I guess the takeaway from that is, you have to understand what environment you really thrive in, And for me, I really learned that kind of solo environment wasn't what I was thriving in. And I had plenty of colleagues for whom I could see them thriving, right? I could see that it worked for them, right? That just wasn't quite working for me. And then what happened is one of my advisors from graduate school was in Washington, D.C. I was having lunch, and I was sort of spilling out my woes with him. And he happened to know the head of the Pew Research Center at the time. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, I got a phone call from the president of the Pew Research Center who said, so-and-so says you might be looking for a job. And I was like, okay. And then, one thing came to another, and I switched gears, and I went and worked for Pew. And what crystallized it for me was the very first month I got there, I walked in the door, and there was a team of 8 people, and they were in the middle of designing a survey and getting it in the field, and I just sort of jumped into it. And we got that survey in the field, and we got it back 5 days later, and we wrote up a report in 4 days, and we put it out, and it was in the Washington Post the next morning, and I was like, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want. I love that pace, that movement, that teamwork, that collaboration. And then the best thing was we did that, and then we moved on and did something else. We started a new project, and we just kind of kept going, and we did another thing, and we did another thing. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. It's really stressful, and I made a comment if you were there last night about stress, and you're not going to avoid stress. That kind of job is not what a lot of people want. It's constant stress. It's deadline stress. It's like, we have to have this out by Tuesday. It's like our competitors are going to get a poll out the next day. We've got to beat them to the press or we're not going to get any coverage. It's like there's a franticness to it. And it's the stress of collaboration. And this is one you have to really kind of get to know yourself with, because you have to thrive in an environment where you're meeting other people part way, and that kind of social engagement that I'm talking about, where your best work is actually somebody else doing their best work. It's a very different environment. If you don't like navigating that, you have to learn that, right? Because then you want to figure out the path that allows you to operate in a way that isn't so interdependent with that many other people on a daily basis. It's a very stressful thing. If you don't like negotiating out that kind of stuff, that's something to learn about yourself, because it's very different. Maybe the college professor life is the better one for you, But that's sort of what I mean when I said last night about kind of understanding the environment in which you want to work. So, being at Pew Research Center then for me is both the mission, right, the work, as I've described it, why I think public opinion matters, but it's also that sort of work environment that I found really connected with me, that nature of the work, the pace of the work, the people, and the integrative nature of the work. And it's about the people themselves. I just love the people I work with. We have a like-minded way of thinking. We get excited about the same sorts of things. And that also is nice, to find an environment in which you have that team, those people, who you all can geek out together on the same sort of thing. So I mentioned before that one of the things we geek out on is that measurement. And, we really are passionate about measuring what's in people's heads. And it's a hard thing to do, as I said, and it's intrinsically imperfect. Words distort, right? We all have thoughts. Many of those thoughts can't necessarily come out in words. And one of the things about polling is there are two approaches you can take. You can just let people talk on their own, and you can get a lot of words, but then how do you add those up to give a picture of the country? You've just got now, you talk to 2,000 people, you've got 2,000 different thoughts, So what polling tries to do is, well, let's quantify it in a way, right? Let's give people words and choices, right? Do you believe A or do you believe B? What's closer to your view, this or that, And in so doing, you're probably adding some distortion, right? You're not necessarily getting that individual's way of thinking. You're forcing them, and sometimes they are uncomfortable with that. It's like, well, no, neither of those are quite right for me, but you're trying to find a way to take 2,000 individuals and kind of make it something that adds up, right? So we try to do a little bit of both. We try to listen to people in their own words, and kind of one cool thing about like AI and generative AI is you can actually process a lot of words now. You can take, people can write long paragraphs for us, and we can, rather than having somebody on my staff have to read 2,000 people's, things, we can kind of use tools to try to aggregate the meaning of what people are saying. There's kind of a lot of interesting progress on that side of the survey world. But at the end of the day, we ask people questions, and we try to do the least distortion as possible in the way we structure those questions. And there are, different ways to think about that. There are biases, there's just error, there's noise, there's complexity. But that's a big part of the craft as we think about it. As I mentioned before, too, we're passionate about inclusion. We obsess over, has our survey included everybody, And it's never perfect. There are people in this country we can't reach. We can't reach the unhoused. There are many of you we can't reach because you might be living here on the campus and you still use a home address, or there are people whose living situations are hard to track. So we'll never be perfect on that front. But we put an enormous amount of effort into trying to make sure that we've got everybody represented as much as we possibly can. And we are, we even put extra effort into, as I mentioned before, making sure we've put, if we're putting our thumb on the scale to overrepresent anybody, it's the folks who are sort of on the edges, the folks who are left out of most conversations. That's a thing we can do, and we can put a lot of resources into that. And related to that, we put a lot into what we call deconstructing stereotypes, that we've, as a society, we talk about this as sort of the, data in this country tends to only go so deep. So there are a bunch of people who are, to use a phrase, almost statistically insignificant, right? There aren't enough people with this trait to show up in the numbers, right? Well, that's kind of crappy. But then there are a bunch of other people who, well, they're enough, but we'll just treat them as if they're all the same, right? Because we don't really have enough to explore more deeply. And that's something we care a lot about. So we sort of do really deep dive studies around race, ethnicity, migrant groups, religious groups, professions, to really go deeper, right? To that there's no group in our country that's really singular, right? And when groups get singularized, that's probably a potential social problem because we're going to create wedges or divisions that really aren't real. So that's another thing that we really put a lot of focus in. And then the last thing I'll say is we're passionate about communication. Like, we have a bunch of researchers, and I've just told you about how we geek out on research, but the thing that really separates my organization from most other research organizations is the communication effort we put into our work. We exist to try to enrich the civic conversation. Our main mission is to get the information we generate out into the public's conversation, and we do that with a really big media outreach effort. About a third of my staff are in the communications side of the equation, everything from graphic design all the way to kind of communication management, relationship management. And that's just an enormous investment of ours because we can't afford to be a tree falling in the forest. We're not here to publish something that goes on a dusty bookshelf somewhere. We're trying to be immediate. We're trying to be in the conversation as it's happening. And we have to put a lot of energy into that because just generating information isn't enough today. It doesn't actually travel of its own accord. You have to push it. You have to sell it. You have to pitch it. You have to get it out into the conversation using all the tools that are available. So that's an enormous part of kind of our institution and so much of a focus of our strategy. So if any of you are in communications, it's an enormous field and it's an enormous part of what organizations like ours care deeply about as we think about sort of the changing information environment. So let me give you a sense of some of the big challenges that I see, and then I want to flip over and have more of a conversation. In the studies that we've been doing, I think there are a lot of challenges that the country faces, but there are sort of three big ones I'd like to focus in on just to provoke your thoughts. The link between them all is that human imagination often lags change, right? Changes come faster than we can adapt to them. And I think that's always been the case, right, in human existence, but we're at a pace where some things are changing super fast, right? And that lag, that gap between our ability to adapt and really take advantage of those changes creates a tension, it creates a problem, it creates an issue. And usually that gap is not filled by people my age changing the way we do things and the way we think. It usually changes because of generational change, right? It changes because new people come in who actually know how to leverage and take advantage and make a positive out of something that's a negative for other people, So that's why I kind of put those front of mind in talking with you. One of those is just the fundamental challenge of navigating in a data-driven world. And if you were there last night, I said, don't go out in the world being afraid of numbers because numbers drive the world. This is a data-driven world. You're going to either have to be a consumer of it or you're going to have to be involved with it in one way or another. You'll be a decision maker and you're going to have to make decisions based on data. Being data comfortable is essential, right? And not all of us are. And there are some very specific problems with data. One of them is the illusion of precision. We've been sort of fooled as a society that because we have more data, we now can have much more precise measurement of things we want to know in the world. This is a sensitive issue to pollsters who get blamed for not calling elections right, when really the polls were pretty close and they were about as close as you could expect them to be, but we want more precision because there are a lot of polls now, right? So a lot of polls mean we should be more precise. No, that's not the way statistics work necessarily. We're not so good at that, and our desire for precision then makes us frustrated when data can't deliver, right? So setting realistic expectations about what data can tell you and what level of precision it can give you is sort of a lag that we see right now in the world of data. Another is bias in data. Now, how accurate data can be is my first. Yeah, data can be biased. Polls can be biased. A lot of the navigation of a biased poll is just face validity. You read the question and you say, yeah, that's kind of crap, Like, that's not so hard. The bias that's more of a challenge is what I call sort of the looking under the streetlights bias of data. We tend to look where the data is best as an indicator of something else out in the world, right? So I'll give you an example at the Pew Research Center. We want to know if we've reached people with our work, so what do we look at? Well, we look at how many people visited our website. Why? Well, because we can track that, right? We have really good measures of that, and we can even track where they are and a little bit about how they got to us, and that becomes a really easy thing for us to analyze, right? But coming to our website is like, if you think about the enormity of digital information today, like that's a tiny bit of our potential impact, right? But I'll honest with you, we hyperventilate over it. We think a lot about it because we're looking where we have good data and we're thinking that's the indicator of our overall impact, right? So that's something that happens to all of us, right? Like we have good data about something and then we think that's measuring the larger reality, and it probably isn't, right? And that doesn't mean that that data is bad or that you should ignore it. Maybe it is the best indicator that you have of what you really want to know. But don't put too much weight in where there is data because you might be missing what's really important where there isn't, right? So that's another bias that I think of. We have a tendency towards thinking data can tell us things that it can't always. And then my third sort of challenge around navigating a data world is just meaning. At the end of the day, data won't tell you what you need to know alone. It needs good judgment, right? It needs somebody who can interpret it, right? And I'm not even sure that AI is going to be able to do that in the near future, maybe farther down the line. And it also requires a recognition of a fundamental in human nature, which is that we can see patterns in anything, right? We can look up at the stars and see pictures of people. We can look at ink spots and see faces, right? The human brain is wired to find patterns. And so now that we're in a world where there's this massive amount of data, big data, polling data, demographic data, other data, boy, can we find patterns, right? But a lot of those patterns may not be any more meaningful than a constellation is actually meaningful, Like, it's really easy for us to be fooled by data, to see things in data that we want to see in it, right? That are as much us projecting what we want into the data as they are actually realities of what the data tell us. And that's another challenge, right? When I talk about that gap, right? We're in a world where we're flooded with data, and I don't think we are quite there yet in terms of how to really not be trapped by it or caught out by it, misled by it, fooled by it. And then at the end of the day, you get people who are just frustrated. They think it's all BS. They think, you kind of throw the whole idea out. And that's not helpful either. Now, another big theme I thought I'd throw at you is sort of the challenge of how we thrive amidst information overload. And you've heard a lot about this, and if you were at my talk last night, I mentioned it as well. But, this idea that, whether you're young or old, we're living in an environment where there's just information coming at us all the time in different formats, in different places. We can't really segment off a time in our lives where we're going to engage with information, whether it's news or otherwise, and then other times when we won't. For most of us, it's just sort of blah, 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 whether it's emails or social media feeds or text chains. I'm not just talking about civic information, I'm talking about your human information, right? It's just like a blur, right? And then that creates this challenge of our attention spans, our mental health, the kind of ways then on top of that either through our intentional choices or the algorithms that drive that information, it creates biases in the information we have, what they call filter bubbles or other things, and we don't even realize that we're not getting all the information we think we're getting because somehow at the end of the day we're only getting little parts of it, and then that feeds into the kind of polarization and the kind of divides in our society. Like, there's a thing going on around this attention-driven economy that we've created over the last 10 years, right? Your value in that economy is your attention, and the entire ecosystem is driven by trying to grab and hold your attention for as long as possible, right? And we, as a kind of human beings, like, we gravitate towards that, right? They're optimizing against us, right? Our intrinsic behaviors, and we haven't figured out yet, I think, as a society, how to navigate that in a healthy way. And it's going to take a while. So right now, you're hearing that conversation about simple things, get cell phones out of high schools and stuff. Well, and that's maybe, a step in the right direction, but the problem's bigger than that, right? The problem is one that I think we have to kind of work through. How do we deal with the fact that our attention is the value, it's the commodity in the world. And if we can get what we want out of that, that's great. But I think right now the worry is that somebody else is getting the value out of that rather than us. And we've got to figure out how to kind of tip that around. And then the third challenge that I thought I'd throw at you is a little bit different. And it actually came up in one of my sessions yesterday. It's rediscovering our democratic imagination. This country has kind of hit a low point in democratic imagination. But I think there are ways that could turn around. And what do I mean by democratic imagination? Everybody's frustrated. Everybody's frustrated with partisanship. Everybody's frustrated with government not being able to solve problems. Everybody feels sort of downbeat about the options that are available in our democracy, about how we're represented. If you look at some of the survey work that we do, the thing people feel the most frustrated with in our democracy is the connection between us, the voters, and our elected officials. We think that that connection is broken. It's tilted. It's tilted towards money. It's tilted towards political ambition. It's tilted towards partisan victory over actually serving my interests as a citizen. And I'm not saying we're wrong, right? There are a lot of factors in our democracy that are distorting the fundamental representation of a democracy. Most Americans feel isn't true. It's not happening the way it should happen. And yet then, and if you ask Americans about that, we'll tell you that. And in fact, we do global survey work, and we really stand out in this front. We really do. The number of Americans who think that the democracy in their country isn't working is higher than in most countries around the world. And the number who think it can't be fixed is higher than it is in most other parts of the world. Not only are we frustrated, but somehow we feel like there's nothing that can be done, right? And so that's what I mean by democratic imagination, because we haven't really engaged in changing the rules of the political process in this country. But if they aren't working for us, why don't we change them, right? That's part of what democracies can do. And I think there are good reasons for it. For those of you who've taken your Intro American Government classes, we designed our democracy to be kind of rigid and hard to change. Constitutional amendments and other things, they're hard to achieve. But they have been achieved many times in American history, right? We've expanded the vote. We've protected rights. We've done a lot of things to improve our democracy in fundamental ways over the last 200, almost 50 years. But we haven't in the last 50. It's been a long time since we as a society have been willing to do that. So why not, right? Well, I think part of it is we're afraid to, right? We're caught up in this political battle right now. And right now, the idea of changing the rules feels very scary, right? Well, what if we change the rules and the other side gets the advantage over my side? I'd almost rather fight it out on a playing field that I at least know the rules to. Or, the idea that we would actually start to unpack kind of some of the rules of our political process somehow feels out of reach, but it isn't, and it shouldn't be, right? And I think that, again, I live in Washington, D.C. That's not going to come from Washington, D.C., because the people who are in Washington, D.C. have benefited from the rules the way they are. And I'm not saying they're corrupt or anything, but the rules work for the people who are already in it, but they're not working for everybody else, right? And I don't think they're working for you all in your generation. And I do think that somehow we have to kind of be willing to lean into some of those difficult questions, whether it's simple things like rethinking the way we structure elections, which doesn't have to be a constitutional reform, to other things like if we want to deal with the role money plays in politics, we probably would have to think about it at a constitutional level. So I just want to kind of leave you with that because, and it was sort of funny that it came up in our class yesterday because I was already planning to talk about this. Right now, it's frustrating to do polling, even though I love it, because what you hear the most from people is this sense of just dismay and disempowerment. And then what you hear is also this fear, this polarized fear, that the other side of our own country is going to destroy us, and from both sides, right? And what you hear is when we ask people, do you think people in our country who agree with you are winning or losing these days? Everybody feels like they're losing. Democrats feel like they're losing these days. Republicans feel like they're losing these days. Somehow we've gotten ourselves in a position right now where everybody feels like the tide is against them. Everybody, right? Everybody feels like the other side is going to destroy the country. Everybody feels like there's nothing we can do about it. And none of those things are actually true, right? But we feel it. So how do we kind of get out of that cycle? And it is sort of unique to this country. So anyway, those are my big challenges, right? How do we deal with data better? How do we deal with our attention better? And how do we really think about our democracy maybe in fresh new ways? So I'll leave it there. You're welcome to ask me questions about anything. I kind of showed up here, went big political science on you a little bit. But like I say, I'm in the middle of Washington. I've had an interesting career, I think. I do a lot of polling. We are in an election cycle. I'm actually happy to talk about any topic. So, thanks.
All right, let's open up. Okay, let's open up
Sure.
for the floor for questions. And if you looks like you want to.
Sure, I can do it. Yeah,
All right.
I'll do it. Yeah, right here.
You spoke about meeting deadlines and the need for coverage or the desire for coverage. Can you talk about what role that plays at Pew?
Yeah, the question is about how much we strive for kind of press coverage. I would say it's a big part of what we do, right? The main amplification of our work in the world is getting it picked up by mediators. Let me just use that term. That sounds fancy, but I think you see where I'm going. It's not necessarily traditional media the way it's been defined historically, like newspapers, television, et cetera. I think there are a lot of mediators out there now in multiple spaces, some in professionalized institutions, some not, right? But that's intrinsic to how we're going to reach people with our work. We can't reach everybody directly. We try. We put stuff on our website. We don't do badly. We have about 1.2 million people visit our site every week. Right? That's nice. That's good. But even then, 1.2 million people in a world as large as this is small, right? We reach a lot more people through the media, through a secondary person talking about our work, covering our work, linking to our work, et cetera. So we put a ton of work into that. Now, it can feel like, you're endlessly chasing the story, right? And there are ways where sort of trying to chase media can create really bad incentives in an organization, right? Like you can try to amplify, you can try to exaggerate the findings of your study. You can try to sort of overhype what you're doing. And I think where we're fortunate in my organization are two things. One, the support we get, the Pew Research Center is primarily supported by a larger nonprofit called the Pew Charitable Trusts. Many of the members of that board are members of the Pew family. It was originally a family foundation. They care about the credibility of our brand over the long run, right? So they're not after cheap coverage. They want serious, heavy coverage. So we do not exaggerate our findings. We don't chase coverage. We don't distort our work in order to meet the needs of a journalist. But we do care a lot about getting our work out there in the media to help reach their audiences at a scale we never could ourselves. And that's just a bigger challenge today than it was when I started at Pew, when there were just fewer, bigger media institutions that sort of drove the whole conversation. But now it's also kind of more interesting because there's just a wide range of media outlets and, again, non-professional media outlets, influencers even, who we care about, right? They have an audience. They reach people. They're trusted by people. If people trust them and they are covering our work, that's a way that our work can reach people that we wouldn't reach. That's sort of the way we think about it, and we do a lot of effort to try to get there. That's the main, any organization has metrics, right? If it's a for-profit business, the core metric is profit, right? In a nonprofit business, the metric is a series of other things that you're trying to achieve. Or at a university, we all have metrics, and one of our core ones is, can we prove that our work was relevant to our audiences? And one of the main ways in which we can do that is how much we can get it into the news cycle, how much we can get people coming to our work in digital spaces, how much can we get people to sign up for our newsletters. You could do that if you go to pewresearch.org. It's a nice, every Saturday morning, you sitting back drinking coffee and you get this nice little overview, kind of what we've done over the last week. It's very relaxing. It's not going to stress you out. Won't crowd your inbox more than once a week. That was my little pitch. But we're trying to reach people in a lot of different ways. Yeah.
I remember you said earlier in this talk that you were struggling to reach everyone because you were struggling to reach everyone because of address conflicts and all of that. How can we make ourselves available to you?
Yeah. Oh, like when we're doing the polling itself? Yeah, so the question is about how do we reach people to do our polls? That's also been a big challenge in survey, and the kind of methods geeky side of it. We used to do surveys over the phone. We haven't done that in a while. If I were to call you on the phone, would you answer? No, right? People still try to do it, but it really doesn't work anymore. Not because of cell phones, but because of caller ID. Nobody will answer a number they don't know. And because it's been sort of polluted by a lot of junk, right? So now we recruit people in to do our survey. We do our surveys online with people predominantly, but we recruit people in through the mail, right? The postal service mail, because that's where we can actually reach everybody. Remember, I talked about really our kind of fixation on making sure we can reach everybody. Most everybody has an address. But also, people's mailboxes are less cluttered with junk today than their inboxes, so to speak. And that's actually a place where we can reach people more easily. Whereas when I was starting in my career, people's mailboxes, physical mailboxes, were full of junk, right? And it was easier to reach people in other places. There's not really anything you can do to be more accessible to us, though. We've got to go out and find you. And the challenge is, though, if your question is like about college-age students, that is still a challenge, because of what I said before. You're not always where you say you are, which is okay, right? Your lives are a little bit more mobile. Yeah?
Can you reach us right now?
Can I reach you right now? What do you mean?
As in, can we answer anything for you?
Oh, yeah, could you participate if you wanted to? Unfortunately for us, you can't, right? So I don't want to get too geeky on you, but right now there's sort of two big worlds of polling. One is what's called probability polling. So if you took your stats class, right, probability is there's a big pool of whatever you're trying to measure, and you take a random sample from it. But you take that random sample. People don't self-select into it. You make this random draw out of that pool. The other approach right now to polling is what's referred to as opt-in polling, where, and you've probably seen this, hey, click here and do a poll and we'll give you a prize, or you'll enter a raffle, or after you've just done some maybe SurveyMonkey survey, it says, hey, would you be interested in taking another poll? Or there are a lot of these things where you're choosing to do the poll. And those can work in some situations. We could talk about this for hours, but they're challenging too, because people who choose to volunteer are, they're by nature, they're not representative of everybody, right? They made a choice that's probably different than the choice other people make, and that in and of itself is a selection bias, is what we would call it technically. So the question is, can you, after the fact, take those volunteers that opted in and sort of statistically kind of weight them and balance them to maybe represent the rest of the people who didn't. And that's, I won't go too deep in it. That can work. I would just say, as a simple piece of advice, if you're seeing polls like about the election or something else, and you see that in their methodology, and I know asking you to look at methodology is not always fun, I would trust their general public study. Like if they say overall, this percent support Harris, this percent support Trump, that's probably reasonably close, maybe just as close as a lot of the really expensive probability polls like ours. But the breakdowns don't work. Once they try to tell you how our Black Americans voting or how are young Americans voting or Hispanic, that's where they really break down. They don't know who they're talking to, and so they don't actually know, like, when they try to break it down, whether they actually have the right people represented. And that's a huge challenge. It's a growing challenge. If you want to geek out on it, there's a whole section of our website on this. But at root right now, at the meta level, a lot of those polls actually do a reasonably good job with their modeling on the back end, but they can't get the kind of detail that a lot of us want out of polls. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, I think in the back, yeah, you had your hand up. I'll get both of you. Yeah, go ahead here, and then I'll get you farther in the back. Yeah, you. Yeah. Oops, sorry, I can't walk forward because I'm getting a feedback, so. Can you hear me? Yeah, go ahead, but speak up.
So I was really interested by your concept of social credit yesterday.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hear a little bit more about, like, how did you find out, like, what social role did you bring to other people, what benefit did you bring to other people in social settings?
Yeah.
And how did you use it to leverage in your career or anything like that?
Okay, yeah, it was sort of referring to my comment yesterday about what I was calling social capital, which is both how are you setting us, how do other people make you stronger and how do you make other people stronger? And on the how to help on the first of those, my main thing is just, if you want other people to make you stronger, recognize what kind of people around you actually do that and who don't, and that isn't always who's fun to be with and not fun to be with. It's like who actually brings out the best in you, right? And that's advice not just for work, that's advice in life in general. But it's also about making it easy for people to help you. So like when I say get to know your professors and stuff, it's professors want to help you, but if they don't actually know you very well, they can't say something very authentic about you, right? All they can write is sort of a platitude. Oh, well, they got an A in my class, and they asked reasonably good questions, right? But what else can they say, right? So make it easy for people who want to help you means getting to know them, giving them an insight into you so that they can then be there to help you and support you. Like I described, by the end, when I didn't know what I wanted to do, those professors had known me enough to kind of ask me probing questions, to push me and challenge me to do something that wasn't really even on my radar. But the other side of it, like kind of how do you recognize what your power is how you empower other people, that's harder, right? But I would say for me, what I recognized, and a lot of it was in that moment of switching when I started at the Pew Research Center, I am a good maximizer. Like I can take multiple ideas and figure out how to get to a kind of best solution out of that, I guess is the way I would describe it. Like, I'm probably not the idea sparker. Like, there are a lot of people in my organization who come up with like amazing ideas I never would have thought of. But I'm the person who kind of says, oh, that's a cool idea, but that idea over there is also kind of cool, and I think if you actually lock those two things together, you're going to get this other thing. Like, that's kind of where I feel like I help empower people. So like when I would be doing group projects or when I was even in a human situation conversation course, like kind of observing that. Are there some people who are like having the aha observation? Are there other people who are sort of connecting and seeing those things? Or are there other people who somebody has the aha thing, but it's a little kooky, and then somebody else strengthens it. And they say, what so-and-so said is really a little bit of this, right? They kind of build on what somebody else's idea was. Like, again, all of us can do all of those things, right? It's not like you're one or the other, but you're probably better at some of those things than others. And then the more you kind of recognize that, the more you see where you go. So like my job now is very much what I was describing, right? I am not the person who's thinking up or designing our individual research studies, but I am trying to figure out how it all maps together. How are we putting together a portfolio of work that will be larger than the sum of all of those different parts? That's kind of the social skill that I have that's turned into like my main career now, my main job, even though I did not expect that, Yeah. And I promised to go in the back. Yeah, real quick. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned AI a few times, and I wanted to ask, how challenging was it to implement AI for your research?
How to implement AI in our research. On the research side, it's more like how could we use it as a tool? Our main application right now would be natural language processing and trying to use AI systems to, kind of understand what people are thinking or even picking up what they're doing in digital spaces and process that to get meaning out of it and not just a bunch of noise. So that's sort of the research application. The bigger anxiety or struggle for us right now is how AI is becoming the sort of replacement for Google as the primary way people ask questions and get them answered in the world. And the Pew Research Center, like most publishers, about 75% of our digital traffic comes through Google searches. That's true for the New York Times, true for most publishers. People get to an article not by coming to the front page and saying, I wonder what Pew has to say about this. They just are curious about something, and then they get a bunch of results in a Google list, and then they click on the thing that they think is credible, hopefully, and hopefully maybe they think we are. That's kind of going away potentially over the next few years. All you're going to get is the snippet. Google's just going to answer the question for you with their AI, and they may or may not tell you where the information came from. So that side of the AI world, like how it's changing the way human beings gather information and judge the credibility of that information, like it's got some really scary kind of elements to it, but we're trying to think of it also as like an opportunity. Like I think we could be really well positioned to succeed in that environment if we figure out how to structure our information the right way and feed it into the AI most effectively. And hopefully our brand, our credibility signal will travel with it the same way it travels with it in journalistic circles. Journalists like to cite our work because we have a good brand credibility. So that makes the journalist in their writing sound credible. Oh, Pew Research Center says, okay, boom, my editor's not going to argue with that. My audience is going to think it's trustworthy. That's good. Well, the AI is the same way. The AI systems are competing to be credible with you right now. So we're trying to figure out how we get into those systems and have our attribution brought in with it so that we are feeding into information into where people are getting it, and we can see who's getting it and whether they're getting it accurately. So those are like kind of the two sides of AI for us right now. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we have to break
Yep.
because of class. Would you take some
Sure.
individual
Yeah.
questions?
Happy to.
Okay, so for the rest,
No, I'm just going to thank the library
Oh,
for hosting us today.
thank the library.
for hosting us, and let's thank
Yeah.
Dr. Michael Dimock.